You feel good?
And remarkably, the answer might actually be yes.
That's the goal. You might want to live long, but even more important, you want to live well.
The Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 was the worst tsunami the world has ever seen. 230,000 people were killed in 14 countries around the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
You were hit by it and survived. You say in your book, Against the Odds, that you were in a place that was both idyllic and the worst possible place for a tsunami. What did you mean by that?
Well, Glenn, it was idyllic. And you can see from this map that Tangol is highlighted there. That's the spot that we were at, which is at the bottom of the Sri Lankan teardrop, unfortunately right in the face of the Boxing Day tsunami. But it was an idyllic spot. I mean, Lonely Planet had said that Tangor was their favourite beach bolt hole. And it was just one of those tropical paradises where you had endless sandy beaches and palm trees and so on. And as you'll see from some of these slides that are going to go through like wallpaper behind me, the before and after effects of the tsunami in that area. But the downside was that we had the Indian Ocean on one side, and behind us we had a lagoon that was 200 metres wide and went for 3 kilometres. And this was a major attraction of the area. It was famous for its bird life and so on. But for a tsunami, this resort that we were staying at, which was actually half a dozen cabana rooms, a restaurant, an Ayurvedic centre, was situated on 300 metres of flat sand between the Indian Ocean on one side and the lagoon on the other. So there was no way out.
Okay, so what were you doing on that Boxing Day before the tsunami hit? And did you have any inkling of what was about to happen?
No idea whatsoever. And I'd been up from 6 in the morning. I went down to the beach to photograph the sunrise. The owner of the place had said, John, you've got to capture the sunrise. And being a travel writer, I was out getting images and so forth. So when I went down to the beach at 6 o'clock, it was very calm. Water was calm, beach was calm, a few fishermen stretching early in the morning, a couple of stray dogs. I got my photographs of the sunrise, which was indeed magnificent. I went back at around 7 o'clock to the restaurant, which had just opened. I got a pot of tea, and I went back to our cabana where my wife Cheryl was, and then I promptly lay down and fell asleep.
Now, let's cut to the chase here. Few of us have any idea what it's like to be in an extreme disaster like a tsunami. Can you describe it to us? Can you actually just sketch it out?
Sure. Well, at 9:25, I was woken up by Cheryl, who was screaming, "What's that terrible noise? What's that terrible noise?" And indeed, the noise was like a jet fighter plane hovering over our cabana, which was impossible. So we leapt out of bed, ran to the window, and as I looked out, there was a young worker running in front of a wave about this high, running inland. And so the noise was absolutely overwhelming. The sight of this wave, it freaked Cheryl out. So she opened the door and wanted to run. And I said, no, shut the door, because there was nowhere to run to. I mean, it was impossible to escape to anywhere. And so at that point, just after we'd shut the door, the next wave had come in, and that was up to the windowsill, which was about 2 metres off the ground. And I was closing the window, trying to keep the water out, watching some water come in under the door and so on. And at that moment, we both looked at the horizon, and there was a 10-metre high wall of water coming straight at us from about 500 metres away. And so I turned around and what do I do? I looked for the highest point in the room, which was actually the bed, which had a concrete base and a thin rubber mattress. So I said, quick, get back on the bed, get back on the bed. And we jumped back on the bed. And as we turned around with our backs against the wall, the tsunami actually hit the building, smashed the windows in, smashed the door in, which came flying across and hit me in the shoulder. Cheryl went off doing tumble turns under the water. And I tried to grab her, but the water was rising very quickly. So I pushed off the bed and grabbed her, and we ended up in an air pocket about this much between us and the ceiling, and everything was going round and round and round like we were in a washing machine. And bits of furniture were coming up, travel bag came up, the door came up, and but it was really chaotic and really fast moving. And so, Cheryl at this point was screaming, "We're going to die, we're going to die." And I, of course, was trying to calm myself and her, and I was screaming, "No, we're not, no, we're not." And apparently I said, "It's not my karma to die now," for some reason. I don't know quite where that came from. So, those bodhisattvas up there, I hope are looking after me. And as we're going round and round and round, time just sort of expanded. And people have said to me, "How long were you up there?" And I really have no idea. But I'd heard of people who have been in car accidents, and they'll say, "Oh, I was trapped in the vehicle for half an hour." But the police report and the ambulance report will say they were there for 7 minutes. There's this disparity with time, and time seemed to expand. I don't know how we were floating around, incredible noise, incredible chaos. And I thought, if this closes out, if this space disappears, then I'm going to grab Cheryl, I'm going to tell her to take a breath and go down outside through the windows and take our chances outside. And I'd also thought, I don't know what happens if the building collapses, because that would be pretty much it. So finally, this rubber mattress came up. We're hanging on to that for a while. And then suddenly all the water went out and we just landed on the floor, staggered outside onto the veranda.
So when you did that, what was the scenario? What did you see? What was going on outside?
Well, I staggered up the end of the veranda. I won't say exactly what I was doing off the end of the veranda, but I was standing there and I saw the manager come down a coconut tree. His name was Preeti, and he came down and he said, "John, how are you alive? The water went right over your building." I said, "Preeti, I don't know." But as I spoke to him, I turned around and all the buildings had been flattened. That's the end of our building, the one I was in. That's the room next to ours. And so, everything was like a nuclear destruction zone. All was there were the slabs of buildings and a few bits and pieces. One other building had survived, and somehow some of the workers had got on to the roof of this building, which was 2 stories, only been completed the day before, and they'd survived. But when they came down, we took a look around. We tried to find people who we knew were there, but we didn't find them, and so we assumed they were missing. In fact, where we were, I found out later, the tsunami went 2 kilometres inland, and between our town and the next town, 40 kilometres away, 7,000 people died. And I think, few people realise that Sri Lanka was the second worst hit country apart from Aceh, in Indonesia.
Were there other survivors around you?
Well,
were there many?
We didn't see too many. We decided we knew that there was a road across the lagoon, a kilometre or 2 up towards Tanggol town. So we decided to run up there, and we ran up there, and we got to a point about a kilometre along where the water of the lagoon was so swollen that it actually was running across the beach like a raging torrent, like a river. We couldn't get past it. And as we were standing there, wondering what to do next, whether to risk it in this torrent of water or whatever, I heard this screaming down behind the sand dunes. And we went down, and there was this Sri Lankan couple, and the woman was wailing and screaming, and excuse me for a moment, but the man himself said in broken English, they just lost their 5 children to the tsunami, and that's her screaming is something I'll never forget. It's, in my nervous system somewhere.
Yeah. Let me just jump ahead. Is that one of the things that has stayed with you?
Yes.
Over that time?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely.
So how did you finally get off the beach, get out of Sri Lanka, get back to the familiarity of your own country?
Yes, that's right. Well, fortunately for us, some local villagers found a way across the lagoon by pulling themselves across it on some fallen telephone wires, because the telephone poles had been smashed down by the tsunami, and they showed us how to pull our way across the lagoon. And so we got inland, that night, a very kind Sri Lankan family looked after us and a few other tourists. And the next day I got a lift back to Colombo, and a week later I was back in Australia.
Now, the whole thing didn't end for you when you got back to Australia. You say in your book, and this is the book here, that you had acute traumatic stress when you came back. Did that become immediately apparent?
Yes,
Or-
yes. It's interesting that when I got back, I didn't know it was called acute traumatic stress, of course, until I'd seen a professional. But what I had, Glenn, were symptoms. You know, I had the whole tsunami going over and over in my mind. It was just repeating like a B-grade Hollywood movie or something in which I was the reluctant star. So this would repeat quite regularly. It was very intrusive and very dominating. And every time it reran, I would think of something else. I would think of one of the fishermen that I'd known nearby, or somebody who'd been staying at the resort where I'd been, and so on. So it built up. And in addition to that, I was being triggered by some things. Where I live in the Blue Mountains, there's often very strong winds, and that sound of that wind was exactly like when the tsunami was coming in, so that would trigger me. And then not long after that, I was driving around in torrential rain, and all the rain hitting the windscreen made me feel like I was underwater again, and that triggered me again. So I had, you know, this sort of thing going on for quite a while.
Okay, so the step out of that, I gather, was to find a trauma psychologist and to be able to, to address that sort of, effect.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'd heard about this psychologist. His name was Darren, and I put his name in the back of my mind because I thought, well, I'll probably get over this. Being a bloke, I thought, it'll go away. Things will wear down. It can't be that bad. But after a couple of months, the symptoms were still there to some degree, and I was, getting quite anxious from time to time. So I did go and see Darren, and I'm so glad I did, because when I sat down with him and told him the story, he said, mate, of course you're going to have symptoms. Of course you're going to be... He said, what you went through is at the extreme end of a traumatic experience. There's no training for it. 1 minute you're asleep in your cabana, a few minutes later you're up near the ceiling trying to save yourself and your partner, and there's lots of death and destruction all around you. So of course you're going to have those things. But he said, look, luckily, that was a great relief to me because, I felt at last that somebody might understand. Before that, I met a Vietnam vet who said, I told him the story and he said, mate, no one's going to understand. But this empathy, this feeling of understanding, the feeling of being in a safe place at last, really resonated with me. And he said, look, I've got this process that we can go through. He had his own process for dealing with traumatic experience. And so we started to go through that. And things started to get better.
This psychologist had worked with Stuart Diver, who
Yeah.
of course was buried underground
Yes,
in the...
indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the second half of your book, and really it's two books in one, goes into how that therapy works. And it's fascinating stuff, it really is. I was surprised that you described it as a learning experience, an adventure, a journey of discovery. What did you mean by that?
Well, it was a journey of discovery because what I found out was trauma is going to change you. It's going to change you one way or the other, so that you will either progress, you will develop, or you will fall into some maladaptive practices like too much alcohol or drugs, which are just, chemical ways of trying to control the symptoms. So, we went through a process that involved, cognitive behavior therapy, exposure therapy, mindfulness, and something called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what that allowed me to do was to get back into the feelings I'd had particularly, because, I hadn't been able to register those feelings in this fast-moving, chaotic situation. For example, when Cheryl was about to run out the door, I didn't have any idea what I'd felt at that point, but using EMDR, I got back into that state and realized that in a microsecond, I'd had this incredible sense of loss, like a lifetime's amount of loss hit me, and I had to suppress it just to survive. My limbic system had cut in, and I was, in complete survival mode. And likewise, when I ran into that couple who'd lost their 5 children, I was still trying to get out of there, trying to survive, trying to keep going and save my partner as well. And so I had no time for empathy. But then when I went back using techniques like EMDR, I found that I had this overwhelming sense of sorrow, you know. But the whole thing became a learning experience, an adventure, because I found out so much about myself. We had to go back and establish my belief system. My previous worldview had been challenged, almost shattered. And so, you know, we had to find out what I'd believed in and done up to that point, and then find out how I'd acted in the tsunami and fit those two together where they fitted and so forth. And so it became a real adventure of discovery, and also an understanding that by processing some of these things, you can develop, you can change, and that there is hope to get through this, to avoid acute traumatic stress, to avoid, I got rid of all my symptoms, and to avoid going on to PTSD. And even with PTSD, you can ameliorate those symptoms.
In conclusion, it took you more than a decade to write this book. Those of us who know you had heard you tell the story for a long time. But was it difficult to write, and is it difficult for you now to recount in front of this audience those experiences?
Look, sometimes, yes, I do find it quite moving, but not nearly as confronting as it was when I first came back. And people I knew would ask me to retell the story, and of course that would re-trigger what was happening. The reason it took so long to write, we're both travel writers, so we're busy trying to make a living as well. But sometimes getting to some parts of the book, which were particularly revealing vulnerabilities, I decided it was more courageous to actually talk about this, to try and talk about this experience rather than just to put it to one side, even though I had avoided the symptoms ongoing. And it was, a challenge. But sometimes I just had to take a break from it, take a deep breath, walk away for a week or so, and then come back and give it another shot.
Well, people have wanted to know many things about the experience. And I think in one of the, was in Good Weekend, where they were asking you when you were stuck in that pocket of air.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, did you see the face of God? Did you tell your wife that you loved all the things that people imagine that you might have done at that time? Or
well, we were very close. We were clinging on to each other, but we were in no state to be saying our fond farewells, actually. It was definitely one of those things where you're trying to breathe and think of survival. And anyone who knows about how the limbic system works, what's happening in that case where your noradrenaline levels are through the roof, you don't really quite know what you're saying, actually. So,
well, John, thank you for reliving it for us. And somebody who was actually fairly close to me says, powerful and profound, against the odds reads like a thriller. Might have even been me.
Might have been you.
And it does read like a thriller, but it actually tells us an awful lot. I'm sure that everybody here today has really appreciated you taking the time to tell us all about your incredible adventure, if we can call it an adventure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.